Floor is all yours.
With it. Thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and just to be in a room full of people with very similar mindsets who are all pointing towards the same kind of solutions. So, yeah, it's a lovely experience to be here. Okay, for those of you who don't know the Good Food Institute, I'll just give a couple of words firstly just to introduce ourselves. So the Good Food Institute, as Bo said, is a non-profit think tank. We originally started in the US about 9 or 10 years ago now, and now we have regions, affiliates across 7 regions of the world. So wherever you are in the world, people in this room, I think you're probably not far from someone who is working remotely, beavering away, trying to get alternative proteins to market as quickly as possible at GFI. So in the US, that's our biggest affiliate. We have about 115, 120 people there. Where I work in Europe, we have about 40 people, about half the size of this room, basically, scattered across 7 or 8 countries, mostly in Western Europe, focused on 3 main things. So we look at SciTech, we look at trying to energize the system, the academic ecosystem. We work with the industry together to try to solve problems. What will the industry need 20 years from now in terms of infrastructure? We can do that being outside the industry. We can help with those projections. And we also work with lobbyists, with policymakers, decision makers, to help people to understand what a regulatory path to market could look like, to help people also to unlock huge amounts of R&D money to invest in the ecosystem to get that academic flywheel spinning and to get science really happening. So as we all know, meat needs a bit of an upgrade. So the most efficient of our land animals is the chicken. And every 9 calories that we put into a chicken in the form of grain or feed or whatever else, we get 1 calorie out. That's the most efficient land animal that we're working with. When we're looking at cows, it's 10 times worse. We put 100 calories in. That's from the soy, the grain, everything that we're producing to get 1 calorie out. That conversion is just not good enough when we're talking about a food system that needs to feed 10 billion people in a few years' time from now. So looking at the land use, conventional meat is just so inefficient right now that it's fueling deforestation, it's depleting our water sources, as you've heard this morning from presentations back at the Meatable office. 80% of our grazing land, of our feed crops, are going into animals to then come out into calories that people can eat. When you combine all that land, we're talking about the entire country of India, all of China, multiply those 2 by 2, add Indonesia, and then you're looking at how much land we're spending on industrial animal agriculture right now. So at the moment, it's just not going to work. This is not a scalable solution. However, as you've seen this graph as well this morning, meat is as popular, it's never been more popular, and it continues to increase. So right now we're looking at, compared to 2012 levels, more than 50% increase in the demand for meats by 2050. And you can see from that graph where the big driver comes from as well. Asia is huge here. And this is largely as economies start to mature, as people get richer, middle classes develop. That's where the real drive for meat consumption is. So interestingly, sub-Saharan Africa is the kind of lowest thread on this graph at the bottom at 6%. But that's predicted to be a big booming market in not very long. So look at countries like Nigeria and Egypt, and look at where the protein needs to come from for those countries to sustain them. Okay, so what's next? We know that the most leveraged, the most scalable solution here is plant-based, cultivated meats, precision fermented proteins, finding ways to basically get proteins from their biological source rather than cycling them through animals. So life cycle analysis, like life cycle assessments that we've seen, basically show that by doing that, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 98%. We can improve our land use by up to 96%, and water use improves by 99% up to. So this is very, very powerful for some of the world's biggest challenges right now. So this World Bank report that I put up here highlighted that alternative proteins basically are the highest greenhouse gas mitigation potential of all of the possible things that we can do in our agricultural ecosystem. And when you look at the next best thing, which is improving feed digestibility, it's 9 times better in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation. This is a huge potential. This is a huge opportunity for us. It's great that the World Bank are recognizing that as well and putting this into a report for all to see. Okay, 20 years ago, we were at a bit of a tipping point when it came to things like the energy sector. So 20 years ago, it was that inflection point. We were on the cusp of people investing in solar. We were on the cusp of government stepping forwards and really putting a heap of funding into getting solar better, getting other renewable energies better. Similarly, it was the same with the transport sector. So electric vehicles, think back to 20 years ago, had any of us even seen one? It wasn't a thing. So that was that inflection point. And right now, that's where we are today with the meat sector. We're at a place where we're seeing skyrocketing protein being demanded. We're seeing diminishing resources trying to provide it. And so we need to find solutions. Until basically this is going to be happening. Every country in the world is going to be facing this same challenge of how we manage that rise in demand at the same time as decrease of resources. And so we need to be thinking about basically in that necessity, there's going to be opportunity. That opportunity is not necessarily going to be evenly distributed, and that's fairly predictable. Where is going to be the place where the big investments can happen and where the big goals, where the big kind of achievements can happen too? So this report was from the Climate Works Foundation, and it was showing that with investment in the alternative protein ecosystem, we could see potentially over $700 billion in revenue back by 2050. Just this week, the Good Food Institute released the reports in Germany, which was looking specifically at the German ecosystem. And I think it was about 120 million euros being invested in the ecosystem, literally means billions of dollars back in a few years' time from all of the extra jobs, all of the extra bioeconomy ecosystem that this helps to produce. So it's extremely scalable at this level, and the potential payback is absolutely enormous. However, we're not there yet. And this is the trick. So the Good Food Institute really believes that the things that need to happen are taste parity and price parity. Those are the two biggest drivers. We can try to persuade consumers as much as we like to eat chickpeas. Great, lovely. I love chickpeas, but is that going to work? We've been trying for decades to try to persuade consumers to eat better foods or to eat more whole foods, plant-based. And that's wonderful for the people that do it, but that's such a tiny percentage. So what we need to be doing is looking at getting alternative proteins to be equal or better on taste, as cheap or cheaper for the price, just as convenient, so just as available, regulatory paths to market, which means they will be on our shelves. And then we believe from all of the evidence that we see that customers will buy it. It basically becomes the default choice when someone's in the supermarket and they're choosing between their frozen lasagnas. They go for the cheap, tasty one. That's what's going to drive consumption. So for us, that's what we need to be pointing towards. So the big question is, what do consumers really think? So I'm going to zoom in here a little bit on cultivated meats. The Good Food Institute has other data for other pillars, such as precision fermentation, biomass fermentation, and so on. So always very happy to share those later. But zooming in on cultivated meat in particular, I'm going to start with some caveats because honestly, this data is not very easy to gather. So firstly, one of the first questions that we surveyed when we did a YouGov survey, I think it was 15 countries last year, is actually, do people know what this meat is? What is cultivated meat? Are people really familiar with it? And you'll see from the results here, the answer is not hugely. Some people are. So it's kind of floating around an average of 35-40% of people had at least heard of cultivated meat. That in itself is a fascinating caveat because all of the data that I show you from now on about whether consumers really like the idea of cultivated meat, familiarity is actually a huge predictor of what they're going to say next. So that's rather important. Another big caveat as well, just to say, is that we don't have a lot of data from different countries. We did this survey across these countries in Europe last year. There is data that I've seen from Brazil, from China, from Australia, and from the US, but only those markets. I think there is some data from others that is in other languages that I'm not familiar with yet, but this is fairly hard to come by. It's also really super early. We found looking at the framing of questions in consumer data as well seriously impacts on the answers that you get. So if you talk about cultivated meat, for us, when we did our survey, we described it in very neutral terms, very honest terms. And so that's the data that we got. we've seen people who just talk about lab-grown meat. That's an instant turn-off for consumers. It's going to skew your data in a particular direction. So some of the data, we have caveats there too. So another big caveat, as I've kind of alluded to, is people don't always do what they say they'll do. People will tell you, oh yes, I would love to buy ethically and I'm very passionate about the environment. And then what they do in the supermarket, their revealed preference there is not really reflecting necessarily what their passion is. So big caveat there. Nonetheless, the data is still useful. And also, because of that familiarity point, if people, as they grow in familiarity and they start learning more, that in itself will influence the data. So it gets out of date quite quickly. So what I can show you is the best data that we've got from last year. It is pretty fascinating. The focus countries, as you can see on here, are all EU countries. And we really wanted to kind of understand, in particular, whether people were open to the idea of cultivated meat and how they felt about it. So this first graph, this first chart and map gives you an idea of this. So the countries at the top were places like Portugal. 63% of consumers in Portugal were open to trialing cultivated meat. That really took us by surprise because we were expecting a bit of a Southern European slant here with a very conservative ecosystem, and it's not at all. So we think that's because Portugal has a really rich recent history with kind of exploring bioeconomy and renewables and sustainability. So there's almost an ecosystem and familiarity with people being comfortable talking about this kind of change. Even the very lowest country, which was Romania, had 35% of consumers open to trialing cultivated meats. And that may not sound very much, but that's 6.7 million people in Romania. That's a huge market. And this is the people who actually hadn't really heard of it. Romania had 25% of people had heard of cultivated meat before we did this survey. So that's actually quite an impressive number. So in terms of, yeah, the numbers may not sound grand here, but when you talk about the millions of people who was involved, actually, this is really exciting from people who never really heard of it before. What was interesting for me here as well as just being so excited to see so many people open to trying it, is the consistency. There's a relatively flat line of the difference between the countries along here. So there's no massive patterns. Netherlands is near the top, Austria, Romania, Greece near the bottom, but countries like Denmark are actually in the middle. It was quite interesting looking at consumer preference there. Okay, our next one, looking at if there is support for allowing cultivated meats to be on the market if it is deemed to be safe by food safety regulators. And the resounding answer is yes. So what people really want to see is choice. And that's, I think, one of the big take-homes for me from all of this. What people didn't really want to see was governments interfering with their food system and governments making political decisions about what should be on their plates. Nobody wants to be told what to eat. What people want is choice. And that was quite exciting to see. But also, I think it's that kind of power of knowing that people want to see choice. That's a really powerful argument to be just accelerating diversification of protein. So increasingly, we're not so much talking about alternative proteins, but complementary proteins, diversifying existing ecosystems so that consumers just have more things to choose from, more sustainable options in the supermarket. Okay, I'm just going to show you another quick result. This was not our survey. It was done in 2021, so a couple of years ago. I would hazard a guess that because of increased familiarity since 2021, when this study was done, the results today would be quite different. But nonetheless, it's a similar picture in the US and in the UK from the study that we did. 70 to 79% of people in those two countries are very keen and very open to try, and they want to buy it. Similar for the numbers of people who would want to replace existing meat with cultivated meat in both countries. One of the interesting ones here is the price one. Are people willing to pay more for cultivated meat rather than their conventional meat that they get from animals? And it's a very 50-50 split. Some people are, but some people really aren't. So that's an interesting one for us to explore. And I think that's going to obviously be, it's in a sense backing up what we think about the taste and price and convenience metrics as being the key ones to drive. Another fascinating one is how things change over time. So what we've seen from the Smart Protein Project is that trust is increasing. There was a study on 10 European countries, ranking, it was framed as cultivated proteins here. It went from 14 to 20% in just 2 years. when we look at the demographics of who trusts alternatives, and particularly cultivated proteins, most it's people like the omnivores, the vegans, men as well. Interestingly, women tend to feel very conscious about the safety issue. So that's something from a marketing potential. It's good to know that because we can work on that. Consumers in Denmark, Germany, Spain, those are the countries where consumers tend to be a little bit further ahead in trusting. Also, younger people, there's just probably a more comfort with technological solutions there. So probably not too surprising. There was another study that was in 2022, which delved into some of these factors in a bit more detail to try to understand what factors really do determine acceptance. There's three main ones I'll pick out. The top one was ethical and environmental concerns. So this is one where, again, I've got a sneaky suspicion that even if people have ethical and environmental concerns, not all of those will translate into buying practice. But still, that's what people say. Second one, public awareness and knowledge. This one just feels like it's changing all the time. So in the UK, just last week, I think it was, there was a first cultivated meats company that came to market. That was with the pet food. The marketing around there and the PR, the news stories were all so positive. They were neutral to positive about, look at this thing. Isn't this exciting? This could be a future, could it? And that's how the kind of PR was framed. And it helps to familiarize people and get people more aware of what happens. So interestingly, when there is more of a market demand and more kind of activity, or at least perceived activity on the market, that also drives consumer acceptance. So just feeling that someone else is already buying this and that this is already happening, that's enough to drive interesting things to happen. Third thing to point out is the third highest one is personal factors, which is, I think, code word for demographics in this study. So again, this is about how old you are, whether you're male, female. It's about where you live, those kind of demographic factors which do influence whether you accept more or less. There's a heap of data in this. It's a fascinating study. Okay, in terms of the kind of information that we can all share, if we're looking at consumer acceptance, positive nomenclature is really number one. So if we talk about lab-grown meat, it's such an annoyingly easy shorthand to talk about lab-grown meat. It just rolls off the tongue, but it's one of the most kind of damaging things for consumer perception. Food is grown in a lab. Food is made in a kitchen. We need to change that narrative and talk in stories that people will be much more comfortable to hear. That familiarity is the second point here. So using non-technical descriptions about where our food comes from, where our cultivated food comes from, being transparent about that. Sense-making strategies where people pick up on a little nugget of an information and they start running with something, which just isn't really the case. We've definitely seen that. We can put our fingers on even some regulatory decisions at national level in Europe being made because of misinformation and people trying to make sense of something which they just didn't really understand. So they just kind of run with something. Taste is obviously a major factor. I'm over the moon that this morning I couldn't really tell the difference between two of the samples of meat that I was trying. Lack of antibiotics, that's important for people to know, but actually whether there's additives, whether there's good safety procedures behind our food, also that's really important for people to know, again, particularly women. Mixed perceptions about sustainability is also key. There's, again, misinformation out there from studies which were not peer-reviewed, talking about the carbon footprints of cultivated meat in a very negative way. That's not what the life cycle analysis that are peer-reviewed that we've seen say. So being more transparent and being more honest about that. And also, as I say, if the price is lower and when market share is perceived as higher, that actually interestingly drives more consumer perception. So on that kind of curve of acceptance that you would get, the early innovators getting in, they'll probably get in anyway. It's the big bulk of the people who only get in when they start to see others in the market doing things around them. That's where things really start to shift. Okay, that was a very, very quick and very focused, hopefully, introduction to what we are talking about with consumer acceptance. Because GFI is hopefully in most of your regions, because we are a non-profit, We make all of our information open source. We are fully funded by philanthropy, which means we're totally independent from industry. It means that we can be very honest. We can be a critical friends to anyone in the industry. And it also means we're very available. So if there's any information which I can help to share, whether it's cultivated meats, whether it's plant-based meats, fermentation, regulatory parts of the market, and all sorts, I can link you up with other affiliates if that's more relevant for you. And we're always here to be laser focused on helping the alternative protein ecosystem to thrive. Well, thank you very much, everybody.